What is up, and welcome to a season wrap edition of Making the Grade. We started the season with one Blake Murphy, and we are ending the season, at least of this show, with Blake Murphy. He's not the only Blake Murphy there is, but he's the closest and nearest and dearest to our heart, right? The Blake Murphy we care most about. How are you, good sir?
That's good, especially since I discovered another Blake Murphy 7 who happens to play quarterback in college football right now. So clearly, at least as I said, my mom knows where to find me. Otherwise, I'll be here on different shows. And yes, thank you at least, of course, for shout out. Good to hear to talk about Cardinals. Season's over. It's super, I think, exciting to head into this offseason. Same record, new outlook for this team.
That's really interesting. You're right. It's same record as last year, but a completely different mindset. I think for any fans who've been paying attention, how we feel about things, the direction, how it's trending, and different feelings about the quarterback. Same quarterback, different dispositions about him, and we can talk about that more as we get into this. But recently, the attitudes about Kyler have started to really change, it seems. I'm going to say hey to some of the folks in the comments real quick, and then we'll jump right into it. We got Classy Nasty. What's up, Professor? Appreciate you hanging out with us, as always. We got Grandizer doing what Grandizer does best, holding down the chat. Hey, Joe, where are you going with that gun? Yeah. Yes, we got Teo Capero. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you. Yo, so hyped for the season wrap. Me too. TCR Stream Hut from Chris Young. So we're gonna talk about the different position groups. We're gonna talk about causes for concern and causes for optimism with certain players. We're going to talk about certain trends that we saw throughout the season within the grades. Certain players, obviously players will have kind of peaks and valleys sometimes. And I think those are important things to look at in terms of when we're looking at or when we're asking the question about which players are going to be part of the future or should be part of the future. So I think what we'll do is we will jump right in and start with the quarterback, QB1, Kyler Murray, and look at his grades. And, Blake, I'll let you kind of get us started with what you think, not only the grades, but everything else that you saw from Kyler, what you think it's telling us, your thoughts on where things are going with K1.
There's a lot of advanced metrics, I think, to go over. The biggest thing I think that's interesting for Cardinals fans is we only really have a sample size of weeks 13 to 18 to really look at when it comes to Kyler Murray. And when you're looking at how he is played according to the rest of his peers, he is not necessarily put up those type of elite passing grades as far as being at the top of some of the other quarterbacks. One of the things that we have seen this year, though, that I think is interesting is we have seen a few changes to how he's been able to perform, especially compared to 2022, which by all accounts was a disastrous season. So despite not having the same athleticism, we did actually get to see a bit better productivity from him in some of these areas that actually matter quite a bit. And of course, the other thing that's good to know is his rushing grade did not fall off at all. He ended up having a solid rushing grade. Wasn't in the elite category of the 90s, but the fact that he is able to go out there and continue to run the ball in a very effective manner should give Cardinals fans hope that despite the ACL tear, he hasn't lost any of his speed. And that's pretty obvious when you look at the tape as well.
Yeah, when you think about Kyler, his first couple years in the league in particular, the term hero ball comes to mind, just a lot of making big plays. And, then that kind of, part of what fell apart for the Cardinals in Cliff's last year was that wasn't working. And, a lot of people talked about how much of that was Kyler. And I think there are some interesting trends in the league that I think are as much, if not more, a part of that. Some of the ways defensive coverages are playing, splitting the field, playing cover 6 and things like that. Saw a great video recently that talked about that, and that what it's really forcing teams to do is try to play to the flat and play underneath, and taking away the deep, kind of passes, or making it much harder to get those. And one of the things that this video saw, and I wish I remembered who put it out, but one of the things they talked about is running the ball is one of the solutions to this shift in defense. If you can run the ball well, it can kind of offset that, because some of those defensive kind of schemes they're playing now are a little more susceptible to the run. So I really think what we saw here is Kyler Murray playing within a system that ran the ball really well. That's one of the things the Cardinals did really well. Eventually, as the season went on, we saw him more under center, and those big numbers you're talking about that weren't there. I think that was a little by design, that they were playing more of a run-heavy offense where that had to play within what the defenses are now allowing, a little more underneath, hitting with the run more. I think there were stats about the Cardinals ran on second down more than just about anyone, I think, in the league.
Yeah.
And they did it effectively. So I think what we saw from Kyler was by design, a little more contained within the system, playing within the system. And as things went on, especially last couple of games, we saw that working a little more effectively.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree. It's also interesting if you take a look at, I've got some stats here I can pull in, at least just looking at the overall offensive play and performance. If you look at the number one rushing graded offense, it's Arizona. And you talk about the Miami Dolphins hanging 70 points on the ground, and Arizona was graded higher overall. And this also includes the entire season, including when they had Josh Dobbs at quarterback. That's one of these things that I find very impressive when you talk about where the Cardinals probably found their sense of identity. And I think it's more they brought it with Drew Petzing, with Jonathan Gannon. They were able to, at times, they would run power on 3rd and 6, and they could still get a first down. So you're talking about a team that normally you got to throw the ball on 3rd and 6. It's like 3rd and long. Anything from 5 to 6, at least, is going to be considered long. Anything is going to be really long. It's going to be further than 3rd and 10. Anything that's kind of between 3rd and 5, 3rd and 4 is going to be kind of shorter and more manageable. This was a Cardinals offense that was not just explosive, but also was dominant in terms of on a play-to-play basis. The way that Pro Football Focus measures stats, take each play, grade across the board from each of the different plays that are set up, and then kind of aggregating that data as it goes by, which means that it's not like Arizona had some hugely, wildly successful plays as a fluke in a couple of games and then it dipped down, but they were essentially very consistent, and that's one of the things I think that's impressive, especially when you consider how this team really didn't have receiving weapons to take the top off of the defense. And you can understand a little bit more that idea of, hey, Colt McCoy is in camp. We're going to cut him and release him. And some of the reason why Bray brought in Josh Dobbs was the athleticism that he had, which I thought was kind of interesting when you're looking at Josh Dobbs as a runner. One of the things that stood out to me, and this is unfortunate that they have him under Minnesota, is it makes it a little, it was a little trickier to have to sort those together. But Josh Dobbs, at least overall, had a 82 rushing grade for the season. This is including with Cardinals and with Minnesota. If you look at the Cardinals with Kyler Murray, at least when he was there, he was actually just underneath that at about 79.1. So one of the things I think that's interesting is, hey, if there's athleticism at quarterback, Kyler is much more talented than Josh Dobbs, but if there's athleticism there, we've seen this coaching staff utilize that and be able to utilize it pretty well. And you can probably take a look at least at some of the games that happened with this year, because in game by game, Arizona, when they did run the ball, some of their best rushing games are the ones that we all remember, because they were the games against the Cowboys. We forget about the Ravens, but they were the one team that actually was able to really run on the Baltimore Ravens. The Niners game, of course, the Rams game, they were just not able to catch up throwing the ball offensively against some of those teams. And it's interesting also to look at over time. I always like to look at how do you begin and how do you end. And what we've seen, at least for Arizona, is outside of the Chicago Bears game in the cold, you had some pretty consistent above average to good overall grades, the same as it was when the season kicked off and began. There is a lot that I think that go into this, but the one thing that we can at least say is that the Cardinals, if their identity is going to be in running the football, they at least did a good job of that identity, unlike previous Cardinals teams. And I think that all does start with James Conner.
Yeah, for sure. Real quick, I'm going to say to some of the folks in the chat, Arthur, thanks for dropping in. Arthur said, yeah, I think that the channel that made that video I was talking about is called Thinking Football. And I think it's the video, I think it's called like Why Offenses Suck or something like that. So definitely check out Thinking Football. They did a great video. I shared it in my Discord server. that talks about that defensive stuff. Rombo, thanks for being here. Good to see y'all. Good to see y'all live to wrap up the season. Thanks, Jordan P. Thanks for being here. Been a while. Team MHA all the way. Robert G. Thanks for being here. Good stuff. Appreciate you. Drew McWhirter, you could easily argue the 4-13 Cardinals more of an idea than the 19 and 18 Phoenix Suns. Oh boy, yeah, that is definitely a little frustrating right now. Alona had a birthday recently. Thanks for dropping in here. A Seattle fan who's probably talking about Pete Carroll being gone. Hi, Joe. How are you? Did you know my Seahawks team moved on from Pete Carroll? The coaching staff is changing for better things. In the future, I'm excited for the changes happening. Yeah, I think we all heard of that, and then. A lot of news and coaching changes outside of Arizona today. Brian with a super chat. Thank you so much. Appreciate your generosity. Hey, Joe, it's been too long. I got to take care of the new baby, and I'll watch the stream later tonight. Go Cards. Thank you, Brian, for dropping in. So you talked about the running game, and it starts with James Conner, and that's great segue to jumping into his grades. I mean, James Conner, you can't say enough about him. He was one of the top-rated running backs in the league. When you look at his grades, he started out really strong. In fact, let's see. Well, it's sorted by week. Started out really strong. Maybe had a little bit of a dip in the middle there, around where he got injured or came back from injury. And then picked up really strong at the end. And his overall grade of 89.2, one of the best running backs in the league. This is just an outstanding performance. And the eye test showed it. He was, he had, and to me, one of the really interesting and surprising things for me in a good way is you think of James Conner as this bruising power back, and he certainly is that. But I think he led the league in long runs over 20 yards. The Cardinals, or they were up one of the top teams in that. He would have these explosive runs, which, you don't necessarily think of. You think he's going to be a bruising between the tackles guy, but he had some really nice runs. Surprise. I think a lot of people are surprised by how good of a pass catcher he is, but certainly James Conner was just outstanding. And I'll let you jump in and kind of share your thoughts on what we saw from Conner.
Yeah, it was a place where we've seen James Conner be able to rush very well, but when you look at the grades this year and how he measured up, at least to some of the top running backs overall in the league, it's really interesting to see that he was not alone in that top 10. We'll talk about the other guy a little later. But we were able to see, like you said, the explosiveness that was able to be found with him as far as for the types of runs that he did, being able to get yards after contact, and then being able to follow that up with being able to have good receiving grades. The player, at least, who ended up having probably the most well-rounded amount, at least for James Conner, would probably be, at least outside of him, would probably be someone like Devon Achane. Was the only other back who was probably more well-rounded than James Conner as far as it came to running the football, protecting the football, even in blocking when other players were doing either end arounds or the likes of Kyler Murray. Like Red C says, yes, didn't even play in a full season as far as the normal 16, 17 games we're used to. But what's interesting when you look at least at the list of the other guys who are up there, it's all right. There's Devon Achane. He's like the Dolphins' huge secret weapon they had this year. Raheem Mostert, obviously their lead running back. The Rams with Kyren Williams, Christian McCaffrey. And it's followed up by James Conner and Amari DiMercato. And so you're talking about that this is a guy who is getting older, but is still just as effective. He's in year 2, obviously, of that 3-year contract. And when he was cut from the Pittsburgh Steelers, we saw them essentially go, hey, you know what? He's been injured a few more times often than not. We've had some problems, and we've seen in a lot of different ways that really he's still been just as consistent at 28 years old. And unlike some of the other running backs that we've seen, like Christian McCaffrey and even a Keaton Mitchell, who took over at the Ravens, their pass blocking was not that great. And when you talk about good running backs and pass blocking, I've got one of those actually on my screen right now if you wanted to take a look over there, Joe. It's got Achane, Mostert, Kyren, you got Amari DiMercato and James Conner. You can take a look. At least the running grades are essentially in the almost 90s. You're talking about elite. Receiving grades are up there. Pass blocking grades are up there. It's really interesting when you take a look at a Christian McCaffrey. You can then talk about what would be the equivalent of a 3-down running back. And Christian McCaffrey, he's not going to block as much for you. They're going to run him on routes a lot, but he's not necessarily that type of a guy. The same when it comes to pass protection. He's just never been that type of back who, when you're trying to have a guy one-on-one line up with a blitzer or a pass rusher, that's one of those interesting things where McCaffrey, you got to split him out into the slot. You're going to have to be able to try to move it a bit. The fact that James Conner can essentially do everything that's asked of him as a running back and do it at a high level, we probably haven't talked about him as an elite back, but this year may be one of the times that we could probably start because there is not a single area to his game outside of health and missing a few games that there was anything to complain about.
Yeah, I think when he's on the field, you have to say, based on what we saw this year, that he was an elite back. As you mentioned, his health is really the only question, and he did miss some games, and that's been that's been the big question throughout his career. He always, seems to miss a few games, and so you need some other running backs, kind of help spell him or kind of cover for him when he goes down. Which brings me to a couple of the other running backs that we have. Michael Carter, who we picked up, right? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting now, these are his grades with the Jets in limited snaps, right? Not particularly good, but then you look at his grades with the Cardinals, much improved. And, he didn't become a different player. I think this is an interesting testament to just how good I think this Cardinals run game is in terms of schematically. And I think that's going to be a strength for them coming in. He's a nice player, not trying to say it's all the system, but you see going from the Jets, very struggled, right? And then in this offense, much better grades. And, he's kind of that change of pace back that I think we need. And I think that, that to me, he was a nice pickup that I think can be a part of the future, for the next couple of years here in that role. What were your thoughts on Michael Carter?
Yeah, I think, like you said, scheme is one of the items at least you can take a look at. And I've got the Jets offense at least up over here. And you can see as far as when it comes to the run type, that usually will be, there's a couple of things that teams will run. Zone will be much more of like being able to kind of read where the blocking is and being able to follow it, whereas gap is going to be more of like that off tackle type that you're talking about, at least for the most part. It's also more of what they would have is kind of like some other different types that they'll have. But what's interesting is that you look at the Jets, they run a bit of zone, run a bit of gap scheme. But you can see they primarily will run more zone overall. When you get to Arizona and you take a look at some of their running backs, you can see at least that Arizona is very similar, but they're more of a gap scheme, which means that the way that you're going to be as far as attacking the football, there's going to be a difference in having the running back being able to read versus having some of those cutback lanes. It's something that comes off of the boot and the play action. So being able to see how a player in one team, you can see an elite running back like Breece Hall, who just had an awesome season coming off of an ACL, can be in that type of a run, whereas Michael Carter, he at least ran a few more of those different zone plays, but then when he comes to Arizona with some of those gap schemes, we were actually able to see he was able to have some nice big explosive plays. He had 6 runs of 10 plus yards, and he ended up, I think it was, with only 37 snaps. So you're talking about, okay, he had 6 of those explosive runs on 37 snaps. Like, this is the time to be able to, like, check my math here. That means that, like, pretty much out of every time that he touched the football, it was like an explosive play. I think it was like 6 different times. So it's like 1 out of 6 carries. So you're talking about if the man gets 6 carries in a game, he busted 1 of them. That is something I think that's interesting to see because it was something that we saw explosiveness from James Conner when the Cardinals were down to starting their backup running backs for a couple of weeks. We really got to see how those rushing grades were really not that great because while people can say running backs don't matter, there is at least kind of a level of being able to find a running back who's effective, playing to their strengths, and then there's not necessarily having that sort of running back. And it's pretty easy to see when you look at the team's rushing grades that with the games that they at least had played with Amari DiMercato, they did well. With the Cleveland Browns game where they had Keontae Ingram as the lead back, it was their worst rushing game of the season. That's one of the things I think that when you take a look at the NFL, it really does matter who you have running the football and being able to find those guys who are good fits. And one of the other things I think that's interesting to look at is Amari Mercado is a undrafted free agent running back. We talked about how he was a guy that was really being complimented about pass protection in training camp. And it was one of the reasons why I looked at him being able to stick onto the roster. And if you look at his grade as far as when it comes to pass protection, he is right up there, at least, with some of the top pass protecting running backs. And as far as the Cardinals go, he's actually at a higher spot like that than the likes of James Conner. So you're talking at least about how you can make a living in the NFL being an undrafted guy. The answer a lot of times is that you can find a specific role and a niche that you're good at. Find a team that can play to some of your strengths, as far as Arizona being able to create a lot of these holes in the run game. And you'll be able to last even longer than a guy who's drafted higher than you were last year as a 6th-round pick, because you at least are getting those protection calls correct. I think that's something that I'm probably more optimistic on the Cardinals rushing as a whole now. It's more just going to depend on the health of James Conner and where those running backs can tend to fall off, because once they do hit the wall, you can really see those grades just kind of take a nosedive very quickly, because there is a set limit to how long the human body can play football for, and that can happen to running backs quicker than anyone, as we saw with David Johnson.
For sure. And, and I'm also very optimistic about the future of the running game. And you mentioned, running backs do matter. And, I think there's there's, this whole kind of mantra of not drafting them early, but that doesn't mean they don't matter. Those aren't the same things, right? James Conner was a 4th-round pick, I think, 3rd, 4th-round pick when Pittsburgh drafted him. You can find good running backs, middle rounds, because the position's devalued, but they do make a difference. James Conner, this offense works a lot better with him than without him. But they do seem to have a good running scheme where DeMarcado and Carter, players that are a good fit for the system, still are effective. So, I think a lot of people have talked about and feel like that the running game is kind of set. I still think that they might look to take a running back in the middle rounds, even with DeMarcado, Carter, and James Conner, to add another guy to the mix who they can develop for when one of those 3 gets injured or falls off. And, I love Conner, but, there is going to be a point where you need to have someone who's ready to be the heir apparent. Hopefully it's not too soon that we need to do that. But I feel really good about that they've got a system, and I think they're going to do a good job finding guys that fit that and bringing them in. And I think the running game is going to be effective as a whole. Real quick, I want to say to some of the folks that jumped in here, Taylor Capero, thanks for dropping by. I put your comment up earlier, but I want to say, hey, Tommy Huxley's a 49ers fan who likes to say I look like Santa, which I kind of do. So happy New Year. Robert Moore, thanks for being here. Appreciate you hanging out with us. I think I got everyone. So, there's a lot of optimism about the running backs and the running game as a whole. And I think, that when you look at it as a whole system, you have to talk about the offensive line, obviously, as part of that, right? So I'm real quick going to kind of go through the grades of some of the key offensive linemen, point out one kind of trend that was shared with me actually by one of my subscribers, and then I'll kind of let you jump in with that. So DJ Humphries, just kind of looking at his grades, we know he had an off year. Started off low grades, had a little bit of a nice stretch here towards the end before he got injured in terms of his grades, finished with a 62.5, which is one of his lowest of his career. I think there's some questions about his future. When they drafted Paris Johnson Jr., I kind of thought Humphreys' time was kind of, his days were numbered as it is. The injury contract situation, we'll see what that beckons for his future. But, the man who they drafted, who I think is going to be eventually the left tackle. I know he played right tackle this year, Paris Johnson Jr. His grades were always kind of consistently around that 60 range, 50s and 60s. I think some of the, the pass block win rate kinds of metrics kind of favored him a little more than the grades. But when you look towards the end here, you see some stretches of green. He really, from week 10 on, he had a little bit of a down game against Houston, but he seemed to his grades seem to look a lot better from there, and so trending in a positive direction towards the end of the season for a rookie, right, is a nice thing, rather than hitting the wall.
Yeah.
Yoda Froholt, real quick, he also, started out similar to kind of having those grades like Paris Johnson Jr., but really came on towards the end. I mean, this last stretch of 5 games was really solid. In fact, Jace shared this with me in Discord. When you look at the centers from week 13 through 18, he was the second highest graded center from that stretch. So Yoda Froholt really seeming to kind of, find his own with the system. Elijah Wilkinson, we know how it started for him. He had some nice stretches after he came back from the injury. Rough game against Seattle. So you wonder how much of his performance was he banged up and he just needed time to heal? I don't know. So then, there's other folks who are kind of more depth pieces on the offensive line, but those are the stars I wanted to go through. So what are your thoughts with the offensive line? Any particular things you want to point out or discuss when it comes to the offensive line?
Yeah, I think you took one of my biggest takeaways, which was with Paris Johnson being able to finish the game on a huge stretch. You could also, at least if you had to say, cover up the teams that they're playing. Which game did he play against Myles Garrett, the best defensive player in the league this year? It's pretty easy to pick out which one that was.
Right.
That's one of those things, at least, where it's like that's trial by fire if you're going to be a rookie. The fact is that he also did not miss a snap this game. So you're talking about, if you look at the block percentages and then the number that he had as far as the times he was opposed by it, it's 100% across the board, which really I think does show that when it comes to areas like we've seen within the past, DJ Humphries, at least even with this year coming in, he wasn't able to fully practice in OTAs. We knew at least that his knee was something that had been banged up over the past few years. He still was kind of gutting out and playing each week. And now, of course, with that torn ACL, you're able to at least take a look at him and say that there's probably not going to be as much of a future for him in Arizona. He's probably going to end up being released by the team. He'll get some extra money for injury due to that. But the thing that stinks about that is that we did get to see him have kind of his best, maybe one of his best games as a pro ever against the 49ers. Anything outside of the 2020 season was the season where he didn't make the Pro Bowl that season, but a lot of times we'll see guys will get the Pro Bowl a year later, or even if they weren't deserving of the Pro Bowl, they'll get in because of where they were a year before. And it's kind of a bummer that we got to see him be able to be kind of return to that dominant self at left tackle against the Niners, only to kind of have him like kind of slink back, at least for the most part, with those games against Chicago, and then of course tearing the ACL early on against Philly. I think that the Cardinals are in an interesting spot. There's people who can mention or talk about what it is with the team that the team should draft. But when you look at their players overall, I've got the team grades overall here for blocking that I've got pulled up at least. And the biggest thing that, I should actually probably share those. That would help at least if we can get those to see those. The biggest takeaway that I had was that the Cardinals probably have 3 guys who are locked in as far as it comes to with their team. They're pretty well locked in overall when you're looking at the offensive line blocking grades. They're doing pretty well, at least with Paris Johnson. The idea is that you want to see him take that next step another year, but he played every snap, got better as the season got late. You're pretty sure Will Hernandez is a guy. He was probably the most consistent guy in being able to block the pass.
Which I forgot to share his grades, and he was solid throughout the year. Had a little bit of a stretch
throughout the year. Yeah. And what's interesting, at least to me, was that with Hjalte Froholt, essentially, we saw him maul guys in preseason. We really got to see him maul them again at the end of the season. You can say that spot is pretty set. The issue, at least, is very much where you can see that you've got your one right guard over at the top with their grade with Will Hernandez, and all 4 of your guards are over here at the left guard spot on the other side. Mm-hmm. And they really were in a curious spot with Tristan Colon, who actually did fine in pass blocking. I think there can be selective data. Sometimes you don't know, did that mean Froholt and Humphries helped him a bit more, or that he was able to take on like maybe easier matchups, they schemed around him, or was it a place where the Cardinals were looking at kind of a losing effort of we're trying to have to run Elijah Wilkinson out there because he's got consistency, but that was probably the biggest negative overall was despite him finishing and despite the high grade, we really didn't see Elijah Wilkinson turn the corner. The one game at least where he looked really good was the Niners game in which the entire offensive line and running seemed pretty good. So I think the Niners are going to have an interesting spot in the playoffs when they end up playing the Rams again. Will be kind of interesting to see because of the Rams' weapons on offense and how they were not able to stop Arizona running the ball. But I did not see enough that makes me think that the Cardinals need to probably go out and get a veteran left guard, someone at least who you probably go, I don't know if you're paying top dollar, but at least being able to cement the position similar to when they got Justin Pugh a few years ago. He ended up solidifying that spot for about 3 to 4 years for Arizona. That seems to be something that could probably take the number one rushing attack to the next level. And I would imagine it would probably help out with the rest of the pass blocking as well, given that they just were not able to get good pass blocking from any of their left guards who played this year. And that shows up, I think, a little bit with how much you can see some of the Cardinals quarterbacks ended up under pressure.
Yeah, and think about how bad the offensive line situation was last year. Billy Price and Sean Harlow, and just really hoping someone would be even competent. And our left guard position was the trouble spot, but it wasn't Billy Price bad. You know what I mean? Like, that was our center situation last year was so bad, and it just felt like the offensive line wasn't always great, but it never felt bottom of the league, right? It always felt somewhere in the range of competent with maybe a little bit of an off game. And, Eric Eager from Sumer Sports, formerly of PFF, one of the things he's talked about and written about is how there are weak link and strong link positions, where certain positions, where you don't want to have a weak link, or your weakest link is your most important spot. And offensive line is one of those, right? Yeah. So you're better off to have 5 average starters than to have one all-pro, another average starter, and scrubs, right? You want to not have anyone who's horrible. And left guard was sometimes questionable, but this offensive line to me looked much more competent. And I think they're gonna address that left guard, and Teo's saying, who knows what happens with Jonathan Gaines, when he comes back. Maybe he ends. I know they were playing him at center. They really liked him. He had some interesting kind of things in terms of combine measurements and such, or scores that kind of bode well for offensive line. So we'll see. But I think you're right. They'll probably look to get a veteran, in free agency, maybe a mid-tier guy who can help solidify that position. But this offensive line, I'm not worried about it right now. I think they're gonna bring in a veteran. I think they'll continue to draft to build it, but it just feels like it's headed in the right direction and it's competent now.
Yeah.
So
I mean, just take a look overall at the blocking grades for this entire season for Arizona, and then you take a look at the actual rushing grades for Arizona. The running backs were like, okay, that's pretty cool. The running backs were there. But then you take a look at least at the entire league in rushing, especially over the last couple of weeks overall. There's some of these running backs who had super high grades. And then as far as it came to run blocking, the Cardinals were not up there as far as with the elites when it came to run blocking or pass blocking. They didn't have any offensive linemen who actually tested into like that above average or higher than usual. But they still were able to have a dominant run game to the point where they were number 1 overall in their run grade on offense this year. So to me, that says that a couple of things. One is obviously the running backs and the fit are great, but the second is that there's probably a bigger impact that these guys are having on the run game overall that maybe isn't fully quantified by everything that you're seeing on some of the statistics as far as the individual player grades. Because as we know with football, you can have every player can have an individually be really great, but it still functions as a team sport.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's with PFF grades, it's tricky because they look at, they watch what the player did and they grade whether they graded positively or negatively, so on and so forth in their assignments. But I think sometimes different running schemes ask different things of offensive linemen, and maybe an offensive lineman, it might not look impressive what they're doing, but for what they're asked to do, it's the right thing. So I think there's a little bit of kind of nuance in the grades with the offensive schemes as well. I'm going to say hey to some of the folks who've jumped in. Calvin, thanks for being here. I think the running back position will become more coveted over the next year or two, including the pay. We've got your co-hosts, Marcos Labrada. Thanks for jumping by. Marcos, hey, Joe and Blake. This is the ultimate PFF review with all the season in place. Lance, thanks for dropping in. Stopped in to say yo. Angel, thanks for being here. Gaines got injured preseason? He was on the IR before the season started. So, yeah.
I liked him a lot coming out too. He had a very unique testing for being laid on his feet, with being able to have a very quick 3-cone. All of the other comps that we saw for all of those types were like long-term interior offensive linemen in the league. Seeing if he can bounce back, because losing your rookie year can be really detrimental to a lot of players, because that's the time where you're able to kind of fail the most as you kind of get into the league. We always forget that David Johnson, the first DJ, really was a guy that said, hey, I didn't know what I was doing rookie year, and it really was when I learned like how the scheme functioned and what worked that it slowed down for me, and I did much better in years 2 and 3. Now, he didn't really get a year 3, but you can really see it on the field. You're like, well, that's how good he was in 2015 as a rookie and didn't know what he was doing. That explains the like nearly 2,000 yards he got as a sophomore once he actually was familiar with how NFL football ran.
For sure. So the running game, offensive line trending in the right direction. I think they're going to continue to build that. Monty has a good track record. When he was with the Patriots, they did a great job identifying, finding, offensive linemen at all points in the draft and undrafted free agents. So I feel really confident that is going to continue going in the right direction. An area where they have some work to do is the pass catchers. With there's one pass catcher I think we all feel very optimistic about, but when it comes to receivers, that was really a tough spot this year. So I'm going to go over the receiver grades, at least the noteworthy ones, real quick. Michael Wilson graded well throughout most of the season, had a few stretches down. For a rookie with a 68.3 grade is really nice, but the production wasn't always there, right? So you can grade well, you can do things, beat your man, do your assignments well, but if they aren't targeting you consistently or on target, those grades don't always equate to production. So the numbers, he started off a little bit better than he finished, and we didn't see the production we had hoped, but the grades gave you reason for optimism. Obviously the injury was concerning, but considering his history. Hollywood Brown had a nice stretch grade wise, and then it was really rough, and the production wasn't great. There's a lot of question about his future. It just really wasn't working. I just don't, even though he and Kyler have a history together, how much of it was injury? How much is it he's just not a fit? How much is it, that they're asking too much of him? I don't know, but certainly his grades were concerning. Rondale Moore is another player that, listen, I love the talent. His grades he had 1 week, 2 weeks with decent grades. And I think
it was very clear this year that the reason why he's probably not getting the ball thrown downfield is he's probably closer to more of a out of the backfield type of guy. We saw at least in that long touchdown against the Cowboys that if you give the ball to him as a running back, but he's also a like stocky 180, but like 5'7", 180 type of player at least that is going to be on the smaller side. And it does feel like in a lot of different ways that if he's going to be your starting slot receiver over a Greg Dortch, we see as he got less snaps and Dortch was able to take over for Hollywood Brown, part of just being able to see the offense get downfield was a lot more helpful versus seeing, the Niners, they will run Deebo Samuel and be able to use those same type of plays. But Deebo, I think the size and the speed, there is at least a separation there that he has that just does not seem to go the same way for Rondale Moore on some of even those same types of concepts.
Yeah, I think, he's always been a gadget player in his time with the Cardinals. In Purdue, he was their entire offense. He was much more than a gadget player, but since he's been with the Cardinals, he's been more that. And I had hoped they would be using him more down the field, and he's really been relegated even more so. Someone shared a stat in the Discord server a while back that I thought was really interesting, and I think I mentioned in here a while back that he was like, I think he was targeted as like the third option or later more than any other receiver in the league, meaning he was not the first or second target, right? So he was often the check down option much more often. So I wonder how much of his grade, kind of being down, had to do with his usage as well, just not being a guy who had plays run for him, targeted for him. I don't know. Greg Dortch, and I'll just run through these real quick and then let you kind of comment on what on the receivers as a whole. Had a couple nice games grade wise. I think, earlier in the year, his total snaps you saw were very scarce, and then they used him more, especially as players got injured. And overall his grades were never horrible. They were stretches in the 60s, a couple nice games, but had a couple nice plays. We all know Greg Dortch is such a, what he does when he's got the ball in his hand. Zach Pascal was a non-factor altogether, other than what he brought in the locker room, in terms of familiarity with the coaches. So, when it comes to the wide receivers, there wasn't a lot to be excited about. I think there's a couple players we liked, but the grades, some of them were okay. The production wasn't there. What are your thoughts on the receivers?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing I saw with Pascal, and this is interesting, but while he still did get snaps and usage on the field, he was often used for clearing some of these deeper routes for guys like Trey McBride and others to be able to kind of run underneath. Just kind of being able to scheme catches in for some of those guys because, if you're a player, even if you're not necessarily going to respect Zach Pascal as much, if you let him just get wide open over the top and blow the coverage, then it's NFL. Quarterbacks are going to hit that. The interesting case, I think, is you're talking about having some optimism at least, and it's not just looking at 1 week, but if you look at that week 10 after getting and finally breaking that Cardinals curse, the number 1 receiving grade in the National Football League for week 10 was Trey McBride. He did at least just kind of show up and was able to be dominant in that game. But outside of him and James Conner, what we've really seen from some of the receivers is there's not another receiver on the team, at least to start the season, that they had who was really able to be that kind of alpha type of guy who was able to be there. And even Trey McBride, after he had that great game, he wasn't able to necessarily replicate it over the long haul as far as with, you talk about some of these elite tight ends like a Travis Kelce is obviously the main type, what Gronk used to be. We've still been able to at least see him have good games, but it didn't look like it was necessarily that same type of elite production. And I do think that part of that is because we saw a lot of issues with the guys who were counted on, like Rondale Moore and some, I think it was, I think he had like some crazy amount of snaps that he had this year and just only ended up with about 352 yards, so he didn't get a lot of yards per catch. Ertz, obviously, we know that he got missed a lot and just it seemed like he lost a step, is not signed with a team at all. The biggest area, I think, is with Marquise Brown. When you talk about paying a first-round draft pick for a player and a receiver, you can look at DeAndre Hopkins for a second and David Johnson, and you can look at Marquise Brown and a third, I guess, for a first, and there's really no comparison. That was just something that I think was a disappointment. And if you are going to try to bring him back at least on a 1-year deal or extend, you almost wonder if you'd be better off trying to hit up the draft to see if you can find someone who can replace some of that production, at least in the slot, challenge Greg Dortch a bit, or maybe even seen some people have talked about there's a really good tight end prospect in Brock Bowers this year. Do you want to try to just run 12 personnel offense on each snap and see how teams are able to try to adjust to each of those? It did become clear overall when you look at all of the teams together for what the receiving grades were that Arizona was not the worst, but one of the weakest teams when it came to their actual receiving of any team in the NFL this year.
Yeah, that was definitely an area of concern. But as you mentioned, the tight ends, Trey McBride, what we saw from him, he had that, week 10 you point out was grade of 96.2, just outstanding, and was solid. Had a few weeks that were a little bit down, but overall was good throughout the season. 76.3. Obviously once they moved on from Zach Ertz and he became the number one tight end, he really ran with it and established himself as one of the better tight ends in the league. And that's something to be excited about. And you mentioned, the idea of partnering him with Brock Bowers, which is very, very intriguing, right? To see what that would be like if you miss out Marvin Harrison Jr. Do you consider doing something like that? I think Elijah Higgins is another guy that, as a kind of a depth piece, he's a 6th-round pick from the Dolphins. We picked him up, when he didn't make their club. Started out a little bit rough, but then you look at from week 12 on, grades in the 60s and even one in the 70s. Here's Higgins' grades, right? First game was decent, then a really rough stretch, but he really kind of found his footing from week 12 on. And, that's a player you look at. I think they still need to draft a tight end, whether it be Bowers or they go someone on day 3, to be sort of a second or third option. But I think Elijah Higgins has shown himself to be a nice piece. So if they get one more tight end in the building, I know they have Swaim, who's kind of the blocker who got injured. He's kind of a veteran, but I'd like to see them bring in one more, and I think that room is solidified with McBride, Higgins, and whoever they bring in. Real quick, let me say to some of the folks who jumped in here, we got Anti-Woke. Do you see us going O-line and defense in the first round? I'll let you answer that first. What do you think? I have my thoughts, but
yeah, I've looking at the players who are there this year picking up 4. You're essentially locked in where there's going to be either 3 quarterbacks taken, so you can get the best player in the draft, or if a Marvin Harrison Jr. goes before you, you're going to be the last team that's going to be there with a quarterback still on the board. That maybe you could say that the Chargers wouldn't take a quarterback and teams would try to trade up maybe a bit less, but you're probably going to be in at least a good enough position regardless, because there's another really good receiver in the class this year. There's also 2 really good tackles, but I think when it comes to team building, there are areas where you can say, hey, we love the run game, let's double down on it as a strength. But you also have to look at boosting your weaknesses as well. It's like, hey, if I'm really good at writing, but I'm terrible at public speaking, I publish an awesome book and I go up and I'm then all of a sudden you realize, okay, he's not a good public speaker. It then will actually hurt how people would feel about the written words that you're going to have. You want to be able to make sure that you're balanced. And like I think you said about offensive line, when weaknesses are strengths, the receivers this year were a weakness for Arizona. When you look at the receiving grades for the team this year, they were bottom 6 in the NFL. The only teams that were behind them overall were the Giants, who have no receivers, the Jets, who have Garrett Wilson, the Carolina Panthers, who have atrocious receivers, the Browns, who had no receivers at least until Joe Flacco showed up and was able to actually hit David Njoku, because Deshaun Watson didn't really target tight ends and they had a couple backups, and the New England Patriots, who are a team that people think could probably use a receiver, but also no matter what receiver you get, if you're going to roll with Mac Jones and whoever else next year at least and aren't able to get a veteran, you're probably going to be in a spot where you're not going to be picking up that high again, knowing New England's pedigree. It does feel like if there's a chance to take the best player in the draft, you probably would want to go ahead and do it. And I think that's tough, but it also is like, hey, this is the first year the Cardinals planned ahead. You already have a tackle who can slide over and be in that left tackle role in Paris Johnson. There's other right tackles either in the draft or free agency you can probably bring in, keeping Kelvin Beachum. He's under one more year as your swing tackle. That's probably the better answer, because then you get to round 2 and you say, all right, cool, we've got really good blocking. Well, we already were a pretty good run team that wasn't too bad at blocking. We're not going to really have that good of a pass catcher now, or we're going to be that team given like 3 years, $50 million to Hollywood Brown, and Cardinals fans are going to start pulling some of their hair out wondering what went wrong.
Yeah, I think it's pass catcher, probably receiver, although unless they go Bowers, right, and defense, probably defensive like line or edge. I think, I know a lot of people are talking tackle because there's those 2 really great tackles up at the top of the draft. I think, like you said, you've got your left tackle of the future in Paris Johnson Jr., in my opinion. And I think Monty trusts his ability to find right tackles on day 2 and 3. And he's not going to go with another premium pick that high with tackle right now when they have so many other places to address and they can make the tackle situation work in other ways. Yeah, I'm with you in that. Real quick, Saltiest Game, thanks for being here. Appreciate you hanging out with us. We got Angel G, thanks for hanging out with us as well. All right, so
one more thing in receivers on this real quick. I did want to show, when you look at when Kyler came back, at least we're talking about like with weeks 13 through 18, at least the last few weeks that he was there. Actually, I think it was, if I was mistaken, like week 10 through 18 here. You look at how the grades played out, and the top receivers for the Cardinals: tight end, halfback. Hey, look, there's Greg Dortch, running back, running back, running back, tight end. You had one receiver during the late stretch with Kyler that did better than bad, and that was Greg Dortch. And that's why we've said, hey, whenever he is there, he gets an opportunity. You also can see, at least down with Zach Pascal, Marquise Brown actually was graded the lowest of the overall offensively. He had a really high drop rate as a receiver. It really is one of those spots of, if you take Marquise Brown off of the roster, and obviously he was hurt, but if you put on another player, you're probably going to end up seeing the receiving group be lifted as a whole, because right now the tight ends and running backs are carrying everybody.
Right. They need to have, or I think in an offense, you need a speedster who can take the top off the defense. Hollywood Brown has the speed to do that. So does Rondale Moore. They don't use him that way, but you can find that guy on day 2 or 3 of the draft. He doesn't have to be a great player. I've talked about this before. You just need someone who's fast, who can run go routes once in a while, and the defenders are going to cover it, right? It's the 10 Ginn Jr. thing, right? He never had great hands, but he could run that go route, and you have to, but you don't want to pay, if you're going to be an offense that's built around the tight end in the middle of the field and big receivers in the running game, you don't want to pay a lot of money for that guy, right? You're not Miami, right? You're running a different offense. So that's why I've kind of moved in the direction of Hollywood, not wanting to bring back Hollywood Brown unless it's a really, really good deal, right? And you draft someone, or let Rondale Moore take that role next year or something, but don't pay a lot of money for that. Defense, we're 52 minutes in and we've gotten through offense, but that's, offense is what runs this sport, right? But we're going to talk about defense, and we don't probably have time to go through the whole defensive kind of roster, but I want to kind of real quick talk about a couple groups, and I'll let you kind of take the lead on what we talk about that. But pass rusher, right? We've got Ojulari, we've got Dimikaji, Gardeck, Zaven Collins, maybe for how long? Cameron Thomas, right? Just the Akeda kind of. We didn't see a lot of great production out of pass rushers. We saw a couple of players having some nice grades, but what are your thoughts on starting with kind of the edge rushers?
Yeah, when you're looking at the edge rushers this year, there was 2 things that stood out. The first one was, when it comes to pass rushers, Dennis Gardeck had the highest grade on the team. No one else was in the 70s when it came to pass rush on the season. That's something that would be concerning. It did show up a lot on tape where the Cardinals were at times just not able to get as many third down stops. They really just had Dennis Gardeck as their top pass rusher, and here's kind of where the flip goes. When it comes to run defenders, he wasn't one of their better run defenders. He is a smaller guy overall that we've been able to see, but being able to have that hair on fire kind of junkyard dog mentality made up for that. When it came to run defense, Zaven Collins was the top player on the team, right up there with Buddha. We have Andre Chacher, at least, was on there too. But what you really kind of saw was the Cardinals being in a weird spot where overall defensively, they had a run stopper at one edge spot. They have a pass rusher who can't stop the run at the other spot. And then Zaven, when it came to his pass rushing technique this year, he was probably one of the lower guys on the team. When you're talking about, like, look at all of these edge rushers who are there, he's the lowest ranked edge rusher who got more than, I think it was Jesse Luketa, I think is the only other guy who got more than like 50 snaps or so in this game. So you're really talking about teams are just looking at, all right, where's Zaven on the field? Okay, if Zaven's in the field, he's not going to get to the quarterback. We can throw it. Where's Dennis Gardeck when he's in the field? We're going to run the ball at him. They really did get more snaps to B.J. Ojulari over time, and that was at least helpful to see, mostly because he actually was up there and being able to make some tackles. He wasn't able to be the best at getting after the passer, but he wasn't the worst. He wasn't the best at stopping the run. He wasn't the worst, but he was consistent. And that when there were players and opportunities in front of him to make plays, he did bring those guys down. So you're kind of talking about a menagerie of sorts where the Cardinals are almost having to like rotate guys in and out to try to be able to cover up some of those defects. And it really does kind of present itself in a way where, as far as it comes with the pass rushing and the edge rushers, I don't think that they have that Batman that's there quite yet. If Dennis Gardeck is going to be your Batman, he's too weak overall against the run to be able to be out there enough. So you're probably going to say, all right, the closest Batman that we had this year was against the run was Zaven Collins and then BJ Ojolari. They're both kind of more of a Robin. We still need a Batman on this team because right now our Batman is just kind of a guy who can rush the passer, and that's really unfortunately like that's kind of what Gardeck's calling card was. He just doesn't have the ability to set the edge. And I do think Zaven was underrated for that this season against the run. A lot of people were like, hey, you got to get him off the team. There's issues here. He did really well overall in being able to be a traditional, like almost the 4-3 stand up edge defensive end type that was able to make sure that if you're running the ball, guys aren't going to get around him. They're going to fill into the run gaps. And he had a couple sacks on the year that were more coverage sacks. It does feel kind of like this position could be in a couple of years, depending on how much Arizona wants to invest. It feels like it's a huge drop off from the days of Chandler Jones, Marcus Golden, and Hassan Reddick that we were kind of spoiled with in Arizona.
Yeah, something they've got to figure out something. They need their Batman, like you mentioned. They've got a couple guys that could be a Robin. Beja Ojolari will be interesting to see how he develops, right? He's more that traditional edge rusher. And he graded reasonably well. He had some moments, but we didn't see him put up the sacks as down the stretch like we would hope. No one was really putting up the sacks. Yeah. So at some point they're probably gonna look for that alpha. Now, part of me wonders, are they going to go with more of an interior pass rush, like try to build that up and work with the guys that they have, at least for now, and develop Ojolari and those guys. And I think if you can get some interior pass rush that can free up and you can make what they've got working, I think, as much as we love Gardeck, you're right, he's really a liability when it comes to the run. I think Ojolari if they go with the interior pass rush and then stick with the guys they've got for now, I think Collins remains that kind of, setting the edge on the run kind of edge rusher. And then Ojolari becomes more the traditional pass rushing edge. And then if you get some push up the middle, you can make that work as those guys develop into their roles. So, part of me wonders, are they really going to go after, a lot of people think they're going to go after that grade A alpha edge rusher. And maybe they will, but I could see them not do that. I could see them try to kind of build that defensive line and kind of build with the pieces that they have on the edge, which I think is a nice segue to the defensive line. When we look at that, it's another area that really struggled, both in terms of production and injuries and everything. I think there's one or two players that I think are a little bit of a bright spot. But what were your thoughts on the interior defensive line?
Yeah, the defensive line of the interior, you really had a lot of struggles. Like Jonathan Ledbetter at least did out there. He was the better interior disruptor, and they did like to basically rush for a whole lot with how Arizona's defense would work, which would be kind of that keep things deep with the cover two, being able to kind of have what you kind of think of as the Vic Fangio style of defense, being able to have enough guys kind of covering up the runs so that way you're not necessarily like fully out there. But this was still a place where there's a lot of room for improvement. These were some of the weakest spots on the team. Poor LJ Collier is at the bottom, and he ended up tearing an ACL and went out early in the season with being a full-time starter with only 37 total snaps. The biggest thing I think, at least with Arizona, is that you can see how they just were not able to have a good run defender at defensive lineman with Jonathan Ledbetter. And because he was their best at getting to the passer, that was something that was one of the reasons why he was on the field a whole lot. But really, the one guy that I think, as far as for an optimistic standpoint, if you wanted to look at, was while Roy Lopez didn't have the best as far as it came with tackling, as far as it went there, he was kind of their run defense guy. And then the combination of Carlos Watkins and Eric Banks, who were able to be at least like good tacklers and at least above enough in run defense and enough where they weren't liabilities as not being able to get to the passer, that you were still not a good run defense. The Cardinals, I think, were the worst overall run defense this year, but it wasn't like you were giving up a 70 to however it was pointer to the Denver Broncos like we saw with even the Vance Joseph defense earlier this season. It was a place where I think that there's a lot of investment that's needed. And it makes sense too, because you're like undrafted free agents. The highest drafted guy here in LJ Collier started as an edge rusher. They moved him to defensive line. And then there's a fourth rounder in Lecky Fotu, who's kind of in his final year under contract with the Cardinals. He's like the only guy I think from the 2000 and I think it was 2020 draft class at least who's left for 2021 outside of I know Cameron Thomas is one of the other guys who was there. We didn't even talk about how we had hoped he would step up either in a defensive end position, but it was probably one of those places of the optimism is that, hey, you're going to get better from here, and at least you didn't bottom out to the point where you're like looking at all of these LJ Colliers out here on the roster like there's been some teams have, especially Denver, to start the season.
Yeah, with the defensive interior, it was just a whole lot of, they call them JAGs, right? Just the guys, just a whole lot of players that undrafted free agents, cast-offs, retreads, just, you would hope some of them would kind of, be maybe, you hope someone like LJ Collier maybe would live up to his draft stat or at least become a serviceable player. Then he gets injured. So that was really tough. But when I look at the interior defensive line, there's really only two players that I hope are still playing for this team next year, and that's Dante Stills and Roy Lopez. Roy Lopez was such a nice find, from the Texans, picked him up, I think when he was cut by them, if I'm not mistaken, or waived, and was solid all year, graded, for a guy that was, I think, a 6th round pick, who was kind of
seventh rounder, actually. I
seventh
think
rounder.
He should not have fallen that far. He actually led the team on the defensive line, which is funny because you look at it, he still ended the year in IR, but there were so many injuries this year that like he didn't end up as a starter, and he played well above more snaps than most of the other players because so many guys missed times. He played in 15 games this year. The next highest were 14. So you're talking about, you're missing at least 4 games. These guys who are at least with Watkins, Banks, some others, they were only able to kind of go into 2 games. So this was the most decimated position group by injury. That's one of the other things I think that was, you can call injury sometimes luck, but also one of the reasons why these guys were available was just not being able to be consistent or stay healthy. Stills being able to go out there and have a kind of like Paris Johnson type of year as a defensive lineman is something that I think is worth hanging your hat on.
Absolutely. For as far, he was a 6th round pick, I think, as well. They got to get the kind of play they got out of him drafting that late is really nice. And, he kind of bringing up his grades here. He started out, first couple games were up, but then had a really nice stretch. And just it kind of got a little bit rough down the stretch, brought his grade down. But feel really good about him as a piece, right? A part of that rotation. And I think Roy Lopez is another guy. But beyond those two, I think for me, that interior defensive line needs to be completely revamped. They, maybe there's one of those other guys that they keep as kind of a depth piece. But I think they need to draft a couple guys and bring in, maybe some more veteran free agents. That's a spot definitely needs a lot of work. AZS, thanks for being here. Monty spent some money on interior defensive line. Yeah. You can get, I think you can get guys in round 3 and 4 also that can really help. Like you're going to find guys, there are guys who are better run stoppers than pass rushers. But if you can pick up 1 or 2 of those guys in there, throw them in the rotation, maybe get a guy earlier who's more of a pass rusher. Newton from Illinois, that would be my dream to get him in that first round. But
I don't know if
yeah.
he'll be there down in the 20s at least.
No, I think
least,
they're going to have
yeah.
to do some moving around for that one, right?
Yeah. The other one to point out also is, just while we talk about some of the people in the
Yeah.
secondary afterwards to wrap up, the linebackers, they have one player at least who you're probably going to be keeping overall. You saw some nice stuff from Owen Papo when it came to actually being able to drop back and being as a pass rusher, which is funny because he had very similar measurables in some areas. He wasn't as fast in the 40, but it was kind of similar to an Isaiah Simmons, to the point where they were, hey, we're going to actually have these blitz packages where, oh, and you're going to be one of the guys who's going to be rushing. And he played a lot more to finish the stretch. But as far as the snaps go, you've got, here's Kaiser White, who led the team in snaps, was a solid tackler, was obviously not up there with other defenders. And then your second most snaps were Josh Woods. And Josh Woods, at least, unfortunately, does not good against the run. He was one of the big reasons why Arizona struggled a lot in terms of the run game, was because the defensive tackles got pushed around. And he was one of the guys that would get sucked up into some of these different places. They did move at least a little bit with him and Chris Barnes, but when they had more and more of the guys got hurt, as you can see, these guys only didn't even play a full 17 games. They were just having to kind of rotate through. It was one of the reasons why we were able to at least see him kind of like be a starter who was good enough to start, because he was better than the next guy. When they did have Owen Papo was able to kind of come in for the most part, things did get better for the Cardinals, but it still was not a great run defense. If Steve Keim, if you're hiding in one of the comments on a burner account or something like that, this is your moment. Cardinals could probably take, with one of those first 6 picks, draft another linebacker, and it would be justified, is one thing I think about this group.
Oh, I am definitely all in on taking a linebacker on day 2. And I think that's where, if you want to have a really good inside linebacker, I think that's where you take them. Right? You don't take them, don't go first round like Steve Keim, but you can find in rounds 2 and 3 guys that will become potentially Pro Bowl inside linebackers. And so I think I would like to see them get one of those guys and then rotate Kaiser White, Chris Barnes, Owen Papo for the other spot. Papo was kind of surprising to me.
You clean everything out at least? I won't mind it as well too. Papo, you can go ahead and finish it at least for that.
I was just saying that was with Papo. The measurables were there, but the book on him coming out was that his linebacker kind of instincts weren't great, his reaction time and things like that. So I was pleasantly surprised to see how well he played. I hope he continues with playing well, because he's got the physical tools. The question has always been, can he, his reaction times and things like that.
Oh, forget what I said about speed. I forgot he did run as fast as Isaiah Simmons did at 225, 439. Yeah, so that you did get yourself a freak athlete, at least if you're the Cardinals, and it'll be interesting to see, does he get into one of those roles? Is he a rotational guy? I think, like you said, they've got Kaiser, they've got Owen. You gotta get another guy, whether it's a veteran. I would go the draft route, knowing with how you were probably wanting to get a long-term guy around. Kaiser's contract is up after next year. That would be probably what I think, is you need to bring in someone probably through the draft in a reasonably high round pick.
Right. I think you draft one linebacker on day 2, and I think that fixes your situation. You bring him in, develop him, and you work with the best of the guys you have left, right? And I think, I think you'll be fine. You don't need a ton of draft capital in that position, but get one bona fide Mike in there. So coverage. This, I'll let you go ahead and get a start, because there are some causes for optimism, but it was also kind of tough this year, especially at cornerback.
I got to add New England here just to take a look at Marco Wilson, because you can't talk about the Cardinals in coverage without talking about Marco Wilson this year. And he would be rated down here all the way here at the bottom, only ahead of J.C. Jackson, who was the guy who was cut by the Chargers, came back, and everyone's like, oh yeah, he's basically done. This is really not good as far as it comes to with being able to hold up in coverage, as far as being able to tackle against the run. Whatever you want to look at it, for the most part, it was not something that was impressive at all. It was why Arizona cut him before the end of the season. What I saw on at least the tape was that you saw a lot more of the playmaking from Jalen Thompson, because he was kind of put in more of the kind of reactive safety role, while Buddha was kind of the back end safety. So in years past, we've usually seen Buda Baker be the guy who's like making tackles at the line, making some of those plays, covering George Kittle's and some of the like. He this year in kind of that too high defense, I don't think he really got to shine as much as he had versus Vance Joseph having more of like, hey, we're going to play press man with coverage. We're going to put a lot of guys in the line of scrimmage. We saw some of those plays, but we really, I think, got to see Jalen Thompson kind of come into his own as far as the arrow went. And he's, I think, been one of those guys that he's been undersung because of who he's with Buda Baker. Now, again, he struggled in coverage like every Cardinals defender struggled in coverage. But he really has overall been a pretty solid player for Arizona since he was drafted in 2019 and more than worthy of the extension that was handed out to him.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and another thing that I think sometimes people talk about is how when a player has a lot put on their shoulders in terms of responsibilities, things that the coverage that they have to hold down and things like that, sometimes their PFF grades suffer a little bit because more is being asked of them. And I think that's the case for both of our safeties, especially with how bad this coverage was at the cornerback position. So I think that, the kind of year he had is not even effectively reflected in those grades. What we saw from him. And I think you could say the same thing for Buda in terms of his play. Now, cornerback, what do you make of the guys on the roster right now? I think, Garrett Williams had some nice stretches. He a little bit suffered down the stretch. Kei'Trel Clark had moments, but what do you think we need to do at cornerback, and what do you make of what we saw at cornerback this year?
I think you're probably going to be looking at least at the way that Kei'Trel started, and you can't necessarily bank on him taking the next step. I think that we saw some stuff that was nice, but not enough. I think the biggest thing that stood out to me in watching the corners was if an older Antonio Hamilton is your best coverage guy as a cornerback, then your other best coverage guys are all safeties, you probably need to flood the position with both draft picks and probably look at a higher caliber free agent. They didn't have a guy who was able to really cover those true wide receiver ones this year, and their coverage got really exposed against the Niners, especially on the back end where they were giving up a lot of big plays to all of the San Francisco weapons and were really not able to do much more than try to get 2 to 3 guys on Christian McCaffrey. And once they stopped doing that, they were able to go over the top pretty easily. They were a sieve this year as far as being able to just not do a good enough job in coverage outside of Antonio Hamilton. And that's where I'd probably would say, at least, if you're a person who said that there's another cornerback, at least that's available in the late first round, between that and a pass rusher, depending on where it is, the cornerback is probably the bigger need because it has been so bad. But depending on where it goes, at least this has been a need that Steve Keim just hasn't really addressed for a number of years, and it kind of the rooster came, I think, to roost, as they would say, in the year 2023.
Yeah, there was some. I put a mock draft on Twitter today, and there was just some conversation about it because I didn't have a cornerback in that mock draft. And a lot of mock drafts I do take a cornerback, but this time I didn't. And the tough part is with cornerback, you're really going to have 4 to 5 guys on the roster, right? The 53-man roster when it comes to quarterback. You have a few spots on the practice squad as well, but there's only so many guys you can have. And we already see this team has 3 or so young guys, Kei'Trel Clark, Garrett Williams, Starling Thomas, they played him a lot. They seem to like him. And then you have Antonio Hamilton. Right, so that's already 4 cornerbacks. And if you're going to draft one and sign a free agent, maybe you can do that and Starling Thomas becomes a practice squad guy or you move on from him. But I guess where I'm at with this is I feel like with cornerback, you either need to draft early to get someone who you think is going to be a cornerback 1, or you go with a veteran in free agency, spend a little bit of money, get someone to solidify the spot, and then let Kei'Trel Clark, Garrett Williams, Antonio Hamilton kind of fill out the rest of the spots. But I think what I'm not really keen on doing is getting another 3rd or 4th round cornerback and adding that. You've already got that guy, a couple of that guy who in Kei'Trel Clark and Garrett Williams, and I like them both. but I think you need to get someone is a bona fide starting cornerback to solidify that room, and that's free agency is the best, the easiest place to find that. Or you're going to have to, draft early. Real quick, I want to say hey to August KK. Thanks for being here. I agree with getting corners, but I feel like you skewed a bit due to how bad the rush has been. That's fair. Matthew, thanks for dropping by, Matthew Jewett and CB. So, with cornerback, I really like Garrett Williams. They kept him in the slot. I wonder if they're going to move him outside. But they kept him there pretty much all year. I was a little surprised that they didn't move him to the outside, but he was playing really well in the slot. Keitrell Clark, do you know why? Was he in the doghouse because he played, then didn't play, and came back for a few games and actually played reasonably well and then didn't play? When you look at his grades, is there something going on with Clark?
My guess is it's a combination of between him and his coaching staff, and is when it comes to film study, tackling, physicality. There are guys who, at least when you see them on the field and are covering, who will, if they blow a coverage and make like the mental errors, there's ways that you can at least say, hey, you're a guy who blows a mental error. The one way you can take accountability is another guy gets to kind of step up and be able to take over that because he didn't have those mental errors that were happening. That can be one of the things that sometimes it can be in a game. Other times it can be something as like practice. And that is one of the spots of seeing the resilience I think was good. Seeing it go away a second time, what I would say, the NFL is a league in which you're going to essentially have to challenge yourself again because teams will adjust to you. And if you're going to consistently put areas on tape they can take advantage of, then you are eventually going to be benched, or in the case of Marco Wilson, released. That's one of the places of seeing how it goes from year one to year two, that seeing enough flashes, I think you can at least say you don't want to just kind of rule it out yet or say he's got a huge way to go. But when they were playing Garrett Williams in the slot, they actually were doing pretty well overall when having Jalen Thompson not having to man that slot role. It'll be really interesting to see what they come out with for next year because, like, similar to the wide receiving group, they kind of need an alpha in that spot too. And so you don't know where that puts Keitrell or Garrett, or what, even if a Starling Thomas or Devon Wilson even come back to the team at all whatsoever.
Yeah, for sure. So something's going to happen with cornerback. I think they're going to go free agency on that one. That's what I think we're going to see, and then they're going to keep developing their guys. Anything you want to? I think we probably kind of got through all the position groups except kickers, but and punters. But
I was about to say no. I was going to say, like, we better at least talk about the special teams for at least 60 seconds, just because.
All right,
Prater, at least with how he did for this year, for the most part, with kicking and field goals and all of that, like. This is where the Cardinals' grade was. Obviously, Prater's the only guy who did their field goal kicking this year, but you're talking about him being top 7, same type of grade as a James Conner or Trey McBride was. It was wild, at least to me, to be sitting in the spot of calm acceptance that the Cardinals will pick 5th, and then he misses 2 field goals within 50 yards. Like, maybe the Cardinals should have penalized themselves and backed up a bit, so it was like 55 to make him hit it. But in any case, this was a season for him. I understand him not making the Pro Bowl. You've got, obviously, a bunch of guys in front of him in McLaughlin, Philly, and obviously the Dallas rookie. You got to give credit to him, at least. That was one of the things. But he did probably deserve props this year, and he's always now going to be, unfortunately, if the Cardinals do get a Marvin Harrison Jr. and he's great, they are going to be remembering him for those 2 missed kicks versus the fact that he was nails throughout the rest of the season. Go for it. I was about to say, nope. You probably have some comments there on the kickers.
Nope, not at all, actually. Kickers are people too.
Yeah. But punting was fine too. We'll go over the punting grades at least for a whole different podcast, an entire hour and a half just talking about punting grades, obviously. So one of the things I did want to say is there's a couple other things that PFF does that breaks down for quarterbacks, and I found some interesting stuff with Kyler the last few years. When it comes to deep passing and some of the other grades, you're actually able to see, like, guys like Purdy and Stroud were having incredible games, or incredible seasons, I should say, when talking about their deep passing. They were essentially just super accurate, something that Kyler did have in his first couple of years, but not as much when it came to this year. You have to actually kind of scroll down a little ways to be able to get to his deep passing. When it comes to some of the other passing that he had, which includes the intermediate passing, one of the areas that Kyler has struggled with in the past, we got to see these are like where the top quarterbacks in the NFL thrive. Like Lamar Jackson might be an MVP candidate. You see Jalen Hurts is hitting the intermediate. Mahomes, Tua's up over in there. We've seen that Kyler hasn't necessarily been up there with some of the top guys. He's down over there in the 30s. You can filter some of this based off of course, like the weeks that Kyler played for the most part, which is going to be like weeks 10 through 18, and then see what else there is a little bit differently there. What I thought was kind of interesting was looking at short passing. Kyler actually was a lot better overall, at least when it came to some of the short passing yards, than it was with some of the deeper passing yards. It was really interesting when it came to like the completion percentage and looking at each of those. And when it comes to like behind the line of scrimmage, let me make sure I get the whole season for some of those there. You can kind of see at least where there's a lot of the quarterbacks who are the top are going to be pretty consistent overall. With Kyler, at least, one of the things I thought was interesting was we've gotten to see that he has not done as well with each of the different passing depths as far as the elites. That's one of the jumps that I think you'll need to see him take probably next year, because this year, obviously, coming off the ACL, the lack of receivers, what I thought was also interesting was, all right, we knew that he was a really good deep passer. It's not quite there yet. Looking at how he did under pressure over the past couple of years compared to this year is probably the story of a lot of different quarterbacks, but especially
can you make that
Murray.
bigger? That's sorry, it's really those. Yeah, it's
I know
really
those numbers are really little. I was trying to make sure that I could at least see where Kyler was for each of them.
Right.
So under passing pressure, we can obviously say that Clayton Tune versus pressure is an odd match that Clayton Tune will want to play. We got to see that Kyler was still having an elite grade of running when he was under pressure. He was actually able to like take off and run the football just as well as he had been able to do in the past. Wasn't as good under pressure, but one thing that's interesting as far as the context is you look at quarterbacks all under pressure have a lower passing grade than their offensive grade. That's just how it goes every single year. This was kind of an average kind of grade for Kyler. If you look at his career overall, what I think is really interesting, that's something that you can actually see a cool story take place. So here's Kyler in his entirety. Let me scroll to that. There's a lot of Kylers before you get to Kyler. There we are. Actually, maybe that wasn't Kyler.
I think you were looking. You got a Kyle and
there's Murray. There he is. It was a quarterback underneath there. So both looking at the passing depth, the passing pressure, those were things at least we can see that as far as it comes to let's see, I'm looking at the career of Kyler, I think at least overall is where I'm trying to find here. We can see 2023 under pressure. He's at, I think it was an overall grade of 47. If you look at, I looked at the weeks where it was week 13 to 18. How did he finish the season here? If you look at 2022 last year, a year ago, there was Kyler under pressure. Yeah. So you're talking about a very big difference as far as with having a more adequate offensive line of how he did under pressure. And you date back to the other years in 2021, you can see at least that he did a good job protecting the ball. Obviously, this is one of his higher grades. He had a good start to 2021. His best year overall was 2020, and even there, he still, at least for the most part, had his best overall year at 82. We got to see at least him hit kind of rock bottom in 2020. We're going to probably be able to see him climb back up a little bit when it comes to the next year. And when it came to the passing concepts that he was able to run based off of, the different players and positions, there was one surprising stat that he was actually number one in this season. So here's all 32 of the quarterbacks. I think I have to change this to the week 13 plus underneath with the offensive grade. So these are all guys running play action. Obviously, Brock Purdy, Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, the typical play action concept quarterbacks. Number one in screens, Kyler Murray, which is very interesting because Kyler and the Cardinals offense with Cliff were not good at all at running screens. After 2019, they were good at running screen passes, did it to David Johnson. This is the first year in which Kyler is not only actually, we've seen the Cardinals have a screen game, Kyler's better than almost anyone at being able to complete the screen game, which is something I think that you'll want to look for in years to come is, do the Cardinals see some of the stuff in the offseason and be able to run a few more of these screens to James Conner and others? Because by all accounts, that is a strength of his and Jalen Hurts' game. And, if you're going to say that you can run those plays to success, I would really like to see the Cardinals do that. The only last thing, at least with time in pocket, just showed at least of how much time he had to throw. And it was probably about basic, but these are more of the premium stats of when you're talking about what Kyler is. We kind of have a good baseline now in 2023. Heading into 2024, you need to see some of those areas improve. And if you do add a receiver like Marvin Harrison Jr., and the grades just aren't really getting up there the same way that they were previously, then you're probably going to be looking at the likes of the Cardinals maybe having to try to look at making a shift at some point or another, just because the way that this game works is you only have a small amount of time you can play, and it's not the NFL if it's not for long. NFL.
Right. Yep. Lot to digest there. So we've covered a lot today. And overall, I think there's some nice players to look at, some of the as building blocks for the future, but there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's some of the young players. We saw some of them like Paris Johnson Jr. kind of, trend positively towards the end. We saw some of them start out well and dip off a little bit, like, Dante Stills. But overall, I think there's a lot, like we said at the beginning of the show, there's a lot more optimism coming out of this season than there was last with the same record. And a lot of optimism for what Monty's going to do. I know, there was the stat that was shared during the broadcast of the Eagles game that the Cardinals led the league in snaps played by rookies, which is really, I think bodes well for the future. They're going to keep adding players, but they've got some rookies who've got some experience. Even if they're backups, they are backups with playing experience. So a lot of nice things. We covered a lot of ground. Real quick, I'm going to say hey to Keith. Thanks for being here. Good show. Thanks. Appreciate you dropping by, Keith. Always good to see you. Cruz Espero, good to see you as well. Joe, been missing you, buddy. Hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you to everyone who hung out with us for this little bit of a marathon look through the PFF grades and the trends and stats. Bottom line, it was a rough year, but one that is building towards something I think we've got some optimism about. And we're going to start looking towards the offseason, and at some point in not too distant future, get going with mock draft Mondays coming up. Some highlight of the year for me, I know. So Blake, is there anything else you want to say before we get out of here, or let people know where to find you, or anything you want to promote that you've got coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, me and Marcos, we're going to be on at 10 a.m. tomorrow, at least, kind of doing a little bit of a breakdown. We'll go over a bit of the film that we've seen from the Cardinals just over the last two games as that rushing attack has really picked up. Otherwise, thanks again for having me on, Joe. I know that the starting out this kind of series you did and then ending it, I think that it's kind of, as moms would say, it's like, hey, I brought you into this world, I can take you out, and I feel honored to be the one to kind of take this series out, as it were.
Well, I listen. You know your stuff. It definitely was great. Kind of going over the stats with you. And you brought a lot of really interesting things. So if there's anyone else who I'd want to proverbially bring me out of the world in this season, it would certainly be you, Blake. I appreciate you jumping on with me tonight. Everyone, check out Blake Murphy's content and his podcast, The Redbird Reboot. Links to that in the description of this video. Appreciate everyone dropping in. I know it's been a little bit of a while, with the holidays. We kind of took a little bit of a break, but sometime in the coming weeks, we'll get mock draft Mondays going. Watch for that. And this is going to be an exciting off season. So thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to put up the shout out to the channel member kind of shout outs, and we're going to get out of here. Peace.